Hello, everyone. Welcome to Memory and History, a dialogue on the politics of commemoration. In this session of the Speaker's Corner series, the Enoch Turner Schoolhouse Foundation once again offers a platform for information and discussion around history and heritage. On behalf of the Foundation Board, we thank you for tuning in this evening. I would now like to introduce the coordinator of this forum, Dr. Paul Axelrod. Paul is a professor emeritus of education and history at York University, and since 2018, the coordinator of 4 educational series for the Enoch Turner Schoolhouse Foundation. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much. Welcome to our panelists and you, our audience, from across Canada. The idea behind these Enoch Turner forums is to address current educational and educational adjacent issues that are important, interesting, and usually controversial. Our topic tonight is certainly no exception, but rather than focusing narrowly on the issue of naming and renaming institutions, we're broadening the dialogue to explore the history and politics of commemoration. And we have a distinguished panel to guide us through this voyage. For more information about them, please Google them. You'll be very impressed. Our format tonight, each panelist will speak briefly, followed by an exchange among them and concluding with an audience Q&A. Please submit your questions in the chat box and identify the panelists to whom they are directed. I'll introduce the panelists in the order in which they will speak. Catherine Ellis is an associate professor in the Department of History at TMU, Toronto Metropolitan University, and co-chair of the Standing Strong Task Force, which addressed the history, legacies, and commemoration of her university's former namesake, Egerton Ryerson. Patrice Dutil is a professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration, also at TMU, and the author of several books on Canadian politics and history, including Sir John A. Macdonald and the Apocalyptic Year, 1885. Jackson Pind is a mixed settler Anishinaabe historian of Indigenous methodologies at Trent University, and the author of the forthcoming book, Students by Day, Colonialism and Resistance at the Curve Lake Indian Day School. David Wilson, professor of Celtic Studies and History at the University of Toronto, is the general editor of the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, and the author of numerous books, including Canadian Spy Story, Irish Revolutionaries, and the Secret Police. Sean Carleton is an associate professor of history and Indigenous studies at the University of Manitoba, and the author of Lessons in Legitimacy, Colonialism, Capitalism, and the Rise of State Schooling in British Columbia. Our moderator is Cecilia Morgan, professor in curriculum, teaching, and learning at OISE University of Toronto, an adjunct professor in U of T's Department of History, and the author, among other publications, of Commemorating Canada, History, Heritage, and Memory, 1850s to 1990s. Cecilia, over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Paul, and I'd like to thank the panelists as well. Without further ado, because I know we've got a busy agenda tonight, I'd like to turn this over to Catherine for her presentation. So, over to you, Catherine.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen for the visuals. Is that visible on the screen now? Mm-hmm. Great. So thank you, everyone, for the invitation to be part of this evening's conversation about how we grapple with the commemoration of people and events whose histories are deeply entangled in the legacies of colonialism. I want to begin by thanking 2 other people. First, Joanne Dallaire, my co-chair on the Standing Strong Task Force, and Toronto Metropolitan University's Elder and Senior Advisor on Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation. Elder Dallaire's guidance and wisdom inform all of the reflections that I'm sharing this evening. I also want to acknowledge Rachel Desaya's very significant and ongoing contributions, first as the task force's project manager, and now as director of TMU's Next Chapter initiatives, with responsibility for the ongoing implementation of the task force's recommendations, the next chapter. If you're interested in learning more about our work alongside other examples of addressing commemoration around the world, I highly recommend this book, The Palgrave Handbook on Rethinking Colonial Commemorations. It includes a chapter written by myself and Rachel DeSea, as well as multiple case studies that are all very informative, different contexts and different approaches to the kind of questions that we're talking about this evening. So how did we get here? Toronto Metropolitan University is the fifth name of our university. It was established in 1948 as the Ryerson Institute of Technology in response to post-war demand for career-focused education modeled on MIT in the United States. From the mid-1950s to 2000, the institution went through three name changes that reflected both its evolving place within Canada's higher education landscape and its aspirations for the future. However, throughout all of those earlier names, the word Ryerson remained constant. That name referred to Egerton Ryerson, who was born in 1803 and died in 1882. Ryerson was, at least until fairly recently, best known as Ontario's first superintendent of education, a post he held for the majority of his working life from 1844 to 1876. In that role, Ryerson established the province's public education system, as well as the Ontario Normal School, the trained teachers, and Victoria College, which is now part of the University of Toronto. A statue honoring Ryerson was erected next to the Normal School building in central Toronto some years after his death in 1889. When that same site in central Toronto was chosen for the new post-secondary institution after the Second World War, it was the statue that inspired the idea to name it the Ryerson Institute of Technology, providing immediate recognition and credibility in 1948. In the early 21st century, growing awareness of the legacies of colonial administration focused attention on the role of education systems in creating and perpetuating racism, marginalization, and inequalities and inequities in educational attainment, particularly through the Indian residential school system. The TRC addressed Ryerson's work in connection with residential schools as well, principally due to a plan he wrote in 1847 for the establishment of agriculture-focused boarding schools for Indigenous children. That plan long predated the residential school system. It was also Ryerson's last known writing on the subject, and his role as Ontario's Superintendent of Education was very separate from the federal government's responsibility for Indigenous children's education. Nevertheless, by 2017, Egerton Ryerson was being labeled the architect of that residential school system. The university had already undertaken a number of actions to address concerns about its namesake, but pressure was growing for a more comprehensive reckoning with Ryerson's multiple legacies. Following global protests in the summer of 2020, the university president appointed a task force which was mandated to conduct a thorough review of Egerton Ryerson's historical role and to recommend actions to address both his legacy and to evaluate the role of commemoration in the campus community. 10 months later, the Standing Strong Task Force submitted our report with 22 recommendations, which were approved by the university's Board of Governors, and implementation began immediately. It continues, as I mentioned earlier, under Rachel DeSea's direction through under the banner of the university's next chapter. The task force worked within an ambitious timeframe and under challenging circumstances during the pandemic. We had very strong support from the university's senior leaders, who provided the resources we needed while giving the task force complete independence. Critically, while we recognized that we were functioning within a colonial model of higher education, we were guided by Elder Dallaire and other Indigenous members of the task force to ground our work in the belief that no one is above, no one is below, no one is ahead, and no one is behind. Regardless of age, stage, or position in life, everyone's voice was equally respected and valued. An Indigenous opening and closing for all of our meetings helped center the group and remind us of those key principles, while our spirit name, Standing Strong, recognizes our ancestors and spirit helpers who were invited to join and guide our work. The task force's approach to community engagement reflected these values and Indigenous paradigms. We prioritized accessibility and equity by providing community members with multiple ways to participate on their own time and in their own terms. As a result, over 11,000 people shared their ideas with the task force, an unprecedented number for any kind of university consultation process of this kind. Now, long before the task force started its work, Egerton Ryerson's name and legacies had become inextricably connected with residential schools, as I said. Moreover, a lack of accessible and unbiased historical information about him had led to frustration with the university and created barriers to critical conversations on campus. Throughout the task force's consultation process, we heard from our community that they wanted more access to historical information. And accordingly, the task force's mandate included several research components. I've put on the screen there the various appendices that are all publicly available that show all the materials and the information, the research findings that went into the development of our final report and recommendations. Our research team developed a detailed and contextualized timeline of Ryerson's life, work, and legacies, and that's Appendix D, Life and Legacy of Egerton Ryerson. It includes discussion of how his views on schooling for Indigenous children developed through his experiences in the 1820s as a Methodist missionary and teacher living among the Mississaugas of the Credit, as well as his plan for church-run boarding schools for Indigenous children in 1847. Reviewing Ryerson's role as Ontario's first superintendent of education, our research drew attention both to his significance in the founding and development of the province's public education system and to less well-known aspects of his work, particularly Ryerson's tolerance for racially segregated and separate schools for Black students and for students from poor families, as well as his opposition and skepticism about educating girls beyond elementary school level. Our research also explored how Ryerson's legacies developed in the decades immediately after his death and continued to evolve through public dialogue and the perspectives of different community groups throughout the 20th and early 21st centuries. A vital component of both the task force members' learning and our recommendations was the disentanglement of history and legacy. History is an evidence-based and analytical understanding of the past, usually developed by academic or other professional historians. Legacy is both the impact of something or someone and the ways in which that impact is experienced, understood, and remembered publicly by a variety of people over time. The distinction between history and legacy is vital when we make decisions about the ongoing commemoration of colonial figures or events. This is because when the historical record reveals truths that are more universally recognized as harmful, for example, direct responsibility for slavery, residential schools, internment camps, the community is more likely to be able to acknowledge that harm and determine the best way forward with more limited disagreement. However, making decisions on the basis of legacies can be more challenging. While legacy is often rooted in evidence-based history, the records on which those scholarly accounts are based are largely maintained by the systems that have benefited from colonization, and thus historical findings and collections can be biased and incomplete. Moreover, the understanding of legacies also develops from public narratives, from current context, and from more diverse perspectives. This means that legacies are much more likely to be contested, and actions taken in response to legacies are often more contentious. In the case of Egerton Ryerson, the task force recognized that history and his legacies did not neatly align. Partial and inconsistent information about Ryerson's career, together with divergent interpretations of his societal contributions and their ongoing impacts, underpinned both demands for change and opposition to it. The task force made 22 recommendations. All of them acknowledge both the history and the legacies of colonialism in our education system, but we concluded that in order to achieve meaningful change on our campus, our recommendations had to be future-oriented. They had to reflect the kind of ancestors we wish to become, or the legacies that we are in turn creating. Moreover, our recommendations had to reflect and advance the university's guiding values, which include boldness, diversity, inclusivity, collaboration, excellence, and sustainability. The result is a comprehensive, values-based framework of reforms and initiatives that cover virtually all aspects of the university's functions, from decisions about current and future commemoration on campus, to renewed physical spaces, increased accessibility to historical research findings, curriculum reforms, additional supports for Indigenous and Black students and employees, and rethinking the university's mascot. And here's just a small sample visually of the initiatives that have come out in the process of implementing our recommendations. Critically, while our historical research and community engagement provided a detailed picture of the past and current commemoration of Egerton Ryerson, our recommendations were not based on either vilification or vindication of the man himself. Instead, we concluded that earlier forms of commemoration no longer aligned with the university's deep commitments to equity, inclusion, and reconciliation. And therefore, our recommendations were shaped primarily by our shared understanding of the ongoing harm experienced by our community members, stemming from what we understood to be Ryerson's ongoing impact and the scope of the university's commemoration of him. We understood that commemoration has many impacts and must reflect the diversity of our campus. Commemoration is also not static. What and how we commemorate changes over time and place. And accordingly, the university must regularly review decisions about commemoration and take responsibility and corrective actions that reflect new understandings of truth and historical research and impact. By mobilizing both history and legacy, our overarching goal was to create a more inclusive campus culture and environment. The implementation of the task force's recommendations is ongoing under the banner of our next chapter. One of the first pages in that next chapter was the renaming of the university, but that is but one component of a much larger process that recognizes both the significance of historical records and the aspirations of our 21st century university community. Thank you.
Hey, thanks very much, Catherine. I'm now going to call on Patrice to present.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You can hear me?
Yeah.
Well, first, I want to thank the Enoch Turner Schoolhouse for organizing this event, and in particular, Professor Paul Axelrod. I took his Canadian history course at Glendon College at York University in the summer of 1980, just as the Quebec referendum was underway. And I wanted to learn about the history of my country. And I was looking for those bonds that kept the country together. It seemed very important as the Quebec referendum was being carried out. To this day, I have a very pleased memory of his lectures, even though he was clearly a beginner and he sported a beard at the time. It's been 45 years since I've seen him. It's a long time, and I want to take advantage of this opportunity to say thank you for your classes, Paul. I'm sure I carry many of your ideas to this day, but I assure you that I carry all the responsibilities for what I'm going to say today. My point is simply this: I remember. My position is that the politics of commemoration in this country are broken. People and events that should be celebrated or somberly commemorated are neglected. Others are given prominence without measure or much thought. In most parts of our country, the process is alarmingly informal. Given the neglect of politicians, the methods used to promote changes in recognition have been remarkably improvised, subject to grave distortions and even corruption, as it was recently revealed in the Dundas affair in Toronto. It's a process that cries out for more rigor, for more structure, for more scholarship. Above all, it calls for what the Israeli philosopher Avishai Margalit called an ethic of memory. My time is short this evening, and I want to illustrate my points by referring to a recent event, namely the decision of the Toronto District School Board to rename schools honoring Egerton Ryerson, Henry Dundas, and Sir John A. Macdonald. It's a vivid case study of how processes have been manipulated to distort and then erase our key figures of our history, men who played critical roles in shaping our society. I think it also raises deep ethical issues. By that, I mean moral principles of honesty, modesty, and the search for compromise. Surely these must be addressed in a progressive, educated, and rights-based society such as ours. Why? Simply because society cannot long endure corrosive and divisive processes such as those that have been used recently. Corrupt processes erode trust, and they cut society from its organic roots and belittle intellectual and cultural endeavor. They encourage cynicism and diminish our vision of our country. In the political sphere, processes like these promise hard swings of the pendulum. In historical memory, as in physics, an action will provoke an equal reaction. In a fragmented country like Canada, this is not healthy. There will be a backlash. Instead, why not find ways to expand commemorations? We need to find a way to compromise because memory is emphatically not a zero-sum game. Yet that is what politicians seem to favor. They have no imagination, no creativity. In fact, they seem to thrive on it. On the evening of February 19th, the members of the Toronto District School Board gathered for one of their typical marathon sessions where important issues are treated with a stunning banality, while banal issues are treated to endlessly repetitive incantations. The subject table that night was renaming the 3 schools. The Associate Director of Learning, Transformation, and Equity, note the title, he's part of the senior leadership team, was asked to report on what the staff were proposing. He described the process briefly. A renaming school reference committee was created in 2021. It consulted 20 community members, people he identified, and I quote, as various stakeholders, caregivers, community groups, agencies and individuals, student trustees, Indigenous, Black, and racialized groups, academics, student superintendents for Indigenous education, system superintendents, 10 school administrators, principals, and vice principals from across the district. In other words, they were all insiders. He then referred to a literature review prepared by staff that proved to be nothing more than a collection of newspaper clippings that documented other renaming ventures. It promoted a particular sort of zero-sum politics. The 3 names had to be eliminated. There could not be any compromise. The report was mobilized against moderation, against respect, and against truth. Identifying himself as a political science person, the associate director then justified the reputational assassinations. Macdonald, he said, could be credited for establishing parliamentary democracy. But, he continued, Macdonald was also associated, and I quote, with government agents who withheld food in order to drive bands of Indigenous individuals onto reserves out of the way of building the railway. The railway was a significant accomplishment for the Canadian community, but it also was at a cost to individual communities, especially Indigenous individuals. It was a grotesque misrepresentation of the Macdonald policy. The associate director then noted that Macdonald, quote, was part in 1876 of enacting the Indian Act, and no less of the assimilation of Indigenous peoples. He continued, and I quote, we also know that the history of this Indian Act, it was eventually repealed, but some of the graves have been outlined and found in recent years, which also was a testament to some of that. Now I'm quoting him verbatim. I don't want to paraphrase, but you get my point. Of course, I'm sure that listeners this evening are well aware that Macdonald was in opposition in 1876 and that the Indian Act still has the force of law. The graves he referred to have revealed no remains. In fact, there are no graves. He used breathtaking shortcuts that inevitably led to a distortion of the past. He turned to Egerton Ryerson and acknowledged that in his 35-year tenure as Canada West and Ontario Superintendent of Education, Ryerson had advocated for free, universal, and publicly funded educational systems and had laid the foundation for Ontario's modern public education system. He also clumsily acknowledged that Ryerson had created the province's first normal school. He said nothing of Ryerson's drive for the democratization of the educational system through elected school boards, his creation of free public libraries, the laying of the foundation of the first provincial museum, and the foundation of Victoria University. He said nothing about Ryerson's championing of Indigenous rights, or of how this Methodist minister defended the rights of Catholics and Francophones in a society that was sometimes deeply hostile to them. What he did say was that Ryerson was also, and I quote, also the architect of Canada's residential school system that committed cultural genocide against Indigenous children. But, he continued, and again I quote, he wasn't the person who necessarily did it, however. Though Ryerson did not directly create the residential school system as it later existed, his ideas did contribute to policies that forcibly removed Indigenous children from their families and subjected them to cultural assimilation, abuse, and neglect. Not that he did this personally, but the ideologies that he portrayed and represented did. Of course, he offered no proof for that claim, a claim that, in his mind, clearly outweighed every other of Ryerson's accomplishments. He finally turned to Henry Dundas. Dundas, he said, and I quote, was a lifelong conscientious abolitionist and skillful politician who had, and I quote, endorsed gradual abolition of the slave trade, suggesting that abolition was not practical while Britain was at war with France back in 1792. And he continued, and I quote, and that was also the sentiment that was used in different parts of the United States as we looked at some of the 1860s and we looked at the crisis that went through within the United States. The TDSB, end quote, the TDSB was promoting the removal of Dundas's presence in the city's schoolscape because of the persistence of slavery in the United States. Then the trustees chimed in. One of them challenged the associate director for not consulting with real historians, experts in the subject area, who could help determine the real legacies. Expertise was not necessary, that trustee was told, because this was not a historical issue. What mattered was that attending schools named for dead white males was psychologically damaging to the staff and students. No research on this topic, however, was undertaken to prove the claim. It had to be believed. As the debate wound down quickly, because historical questions were quickly exhausted, another trustee introduced the issue of race. And I quote, people who have a lot of privilege start to question the racialized trustees about our commitment to this country, whereas non-racialized trustees will not be asked about that. And that is the kind of world that we are living in. So let's be real. I'm glad that many trustees who are non-racialized have stood up and, as true allies, stood up in front of us to say that enough is enough. We need a shift, end quote. The resolution was carried by a vote of 11-7. 4 of the racialized trustees voted in favor. 4 racialized trustees voted against it, and 3 of them, of the racialized trustees, were notably absent. The trustee who raised the issue of race was as flat wrong about the politics of his own board as he was about history. He assumed that because the real issue as he saw it was race, all non-white trustees would support it. It was a complete breakdown of ethics. The process used by the TDSB was drawn from what is now a classic playbook. It started with a decision made at the highest executive level, where there is no respect for history, for tradition, or for remembrance. A committee of like-minded people was struck to justify it, and a mediocre research document was produced to legitimize the decision. No meaningful consultation was organized except among racialized groups. As always, the documentation provided no proof that Macdonald, Ryerson, or Dundas, 3 men that shaped the country by promoting abolition, education, and nation building, be condemned. This raises a host of issues. For one, is the TDSB capable of undertaking such a sensitive task? The answer is a resounding no. Like in Montreal, Toronto, Kingston, Hamilton, and so many other communities from coast to coast, the decision to rename was deliberately made in historical ignorance and in the dark, far from the glare of knowledge and open reflection. The story's not over, however, because the TDSB abused its authority. Both the Toronto Star and the Globe and Mail, newspapers that have carefully avoided taking a position on issues of renaming, published pieces by their regular commentators condemning the TDSB decision. In a recent online poll of 12,000 people conducted by 6Buzz, 84% of respondents expressed opposition to the TDSB's decision to rename the schools. The results clearly reflect a growing sentiment among citizens, namely that renaming efforts have been led by individuals who are untrustworthy and unaccountable. The newly elected provincial government under Doug Ford has announced that it is launching a review of the deficits run by the TDSB, and speculation is rife that the $120,000 expense that will be incurred with the renaming of the 3 schools will be denied. That would be good news, but it would be bad news. Many schools, streets, and parks deserve to be renamed for the good of the community. There are countless opportunities to repair the neglect of the historical contributions of various segments of the population in Toronto. This could easily allow for the maintenance of Dundas, Ryerson, and Macdonald and their names on buildings as a recognition of their outsized contribution of good and development of our society. It would also be an opportunity to rebuild our culture and to strengthen its tolerance without pulling out all of its roots and its best traditions. A profound commitment to ethical decision-making should allow this. Those school names should not be saved by vulgar financial concerns. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Patrice. So I'm going to move over to Jackson now and ask Jackson to present.
Miigwech, thank you. Just like to start off by thanking Paul Axelrod for the invitation to join this panel this evening, as well as the Enoch Turner Foundation as well for hosting this event. So my talk will touch on some of the things Patrice was talking about. I'm sure we'll have further conversation after everyone presents. But my presentation today is going to be called From Cataraqui to Ngojwanon, Memory and Commemoration. And that's Kingston's original name as well as Peterborough. And we'll be talking about that geographical area, some of the controversies that have happened in these places, as well as some of the work that I've been involved in to try to expand, I think, our understandings of memory towards more Indigenous understandings. So just as a frame of reference, here is where I'm speaking about. I think it's important to put that in mind as well. My community is in Alderville First Nation, which is kind of sandwiched between two of these, you could say, settler towns in many ways. And we were forcibly removed from Kingston in 1837, and we'll get back to that a few slides from now, talking about some of the commemoration that has happened in Kingston specifically. So as I said, I'm going to focus more on Peterborough tonight, but I think I'm going to start off with Kingston, as I was involved, I think, in a lot of the work that's been going on there in that town to try to make sure that other stories are told about the past and not so much of a focus on Sir John A. Macdonald, obviously, I think has got the most media attention. And if you look right now, I was there when they took down the statue. It was a very proud moment for our communities who kind of rallied together and really forced City Council to make this decision. And I would say it was grounded in a lot of historical research, as well as the feelings of Indigenous people who had gone downtown and seen his statue kind of towering over us as you go downtown Kingston. And I would argue in many ways that the removal of this statue wasn't actually the removal of him throughout the town. I think if you go to Kingston now, there's still many examples where you can learn about his history, as well as see his name quite presently in many of the places in town. And it was just the removal, I think, of the most visible form of Sir John A. Macdonald, which was obviously the statue. And unfortunately, that got most of the media attention and not some of the work that's been done since to expand the narrative in many ways about Indigenous people. So if you look, one of the largest streets in Kingston is still named after him, Sir John A. Macdonald Boulevard. It is basically the major north-south corridor that goes basically right off the 401 down towards Lake Ontario. So they have not removed that name as of yet. Potentially that could be on the agenda over the next few years, but for so long you can still see his name. If you want to go down in that area, you can still go to the Bellevue House, which is now still a National Historic Site. So they have not removed any mention of Sir John A. Macdonald at that site. They have actually included some Indigenous perspectives now, which I think broaden the story on Sir John A. Macdonald and not just the narratives of kind of Canadian nation building. And as well, you can still see plaques referencing him downtown at his favorite drinking spot. The bar actually changed the name. They didn't want to be associated with Sir John A. Macdonald, which I think speaks a lot for maybe the politics that were happening in town at that time. And actually, if you talk to the bar owner, he actually said that he wanted to change that on his own behalf, not because of anything that was happening, but because patrons of the bar came to him and said they wanted to change that as they did not feel comfortable with his name being on that site no longer. As well, there's multiple other plaques around town where you can still see references and learn about Sir John A. Macdonald. These are not the only ones. There's a few houses around that he either lived at or his sister's friends kind of lived at, other people in his life. and it did not remove Sir John A. Macdonald. And instead, I think the removal of the statue did open up new narratives of Indigenous people that we can now see really throughout Kingston. I think the major site, which I encourage you to go visit if you are going to Kingston this summer, is Manitou Otagon, which is our word for spirit garden. And this was enacted that same kind of summer when all of that press was going on about Sir John A. Macdonald. This was the only really local story that told about it in the Kingston Whig. And you can see what it was basically about. It was that it was going to commemorate Alderville First Nation and really our forced relocation from the Kingston area in 1837, which is a really, I would say, understudied period in Canadian history. But our communities were forced from basically the Bay of Quinte and Grape Island, basically all around Kingston, kind of rounded up and sent to Alderville First Nation. And that was never commemorated in any of the sites across Kingston until this garden was created. And we created this garden not to be another statue that imposes on a place, but I think it's really beautiful in the sense it's actually developed exactly onto this site at Lake Ontario Park, which is in the west, kind of downtown, just outside of the old prison. So I'd encourage you to go check that out. And if you look at the site, I could talk about the site for a while. You kind of have to go and experience it to understand some of the symbology behind it, but this is an overview of what it looks like from the air. And there's lots of symbology here. Again, I can't get into all of it tonight, but there's 7 rocks here that symbolize our 7 grandfather teachings. There's 13 rocks that symbolize our moon around kind of the center of the garden, as well as a lot of treaty belts that are baked into the site as well that talk about the original relationship between settlers and Indigenous peoples who came to this place. And I think those are important stories that were never really talked about in Kingston. I saw when I was doing my PhD here until this site actually came to fruition. So this is just a picture of what it looks like in the summer right now. It's slowly starting to look like that again. It changes with the seasons, which is really beautiful. And before you walk in, you pass these 2 treaty belts, which you can see on the ground here, which is the 1764 Treaty of Niagara, which is the originally, I would say, founding document of this country. Without that treaty, Canada would not be what it is today. It's more important, I think, than anything that Ryerson or John A. Macdonald or any European settlers did, because it was a founding agreement between First Nations to share this land, as well as the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, which was between us and the Haudenosaunees to share Lake Ontario, as we had been at war for many years before that agreement, and we agreed to share and put down our weapons to share the resources of that lake. And that agreement still stands, both of those, to this day. So I have just a quick little drone video. I think it's only 20 seconds. It has some music behind it that I took a couple summers ago just to give you its perspective in place. And the music is William Prince. So if you know him, he's a Anishinaabe artist. I encourage you to check out him as well. But I think this video gives you a good idea of the site and how important it is to our people now in Kingston.
Is the silence quiet or loud? A lifetime of questions, lost and profound, professing to a silhouette of trees on the ground here in front of me. When you miss someone, tears you apart and then some.
So a very beautiful site. Again, I encourage you to check it out in Kingston. There's a lot of historical sites, but I think this is going to be a really important one for our legacy, I think, as Anishinaabe people in this area. And when I experienced that and was really proud to see that site, I've really tried to work, once I came to Trent about 3 years ago, to really tell new stories about history and really prioritize Indigenous narratives, which I found to be really lacking in a lot of the media discussions. And one of the projects that I'll talk about this evening is this partnership that we have with Ontario Heritage Trust, who is also going through a similar process to look at some of their plaques, and especially ones that they feel are outdated or somewhat offensive, and to bring Indigenous perspectives in it. So at Trent University, in their first year course, we asked students actually to create a new historical plaque after they go through the first year Indigenous 1001. And we asked them to create a plaque that's based from their homelands or their home territory. And it's amazing what students create and the new stories that they bring forward. And we're lucky enough last fall, or I guess almost the start of the winter, to have this kind of showing of the plaques. I think some of the best plaques that were created over the last couple of years that tell new stories about Indigenous histories. And again, they focus Indigenous narratives, either places, people, or events. and really try to criticize as well some of the plaques that have been erected in their hometowns that don't tell the full story of Indigenous present. So we have a map that's currently being created. It should be launched over the next couple of weeks or so. And it's really going to show this new distribution of plaques. And we're really excited to launch this initiative. You can see some of them just as a little hint of ones that are being created as we speak. And again, each one of these have been created by students that have gone through kind of their first learning, I would say, in many ways, of Indigenous history in a fulsome scale, and really telling different narratives about what they want to see in their communities. And again, there's so many I could show you. There's been over 100 that have been submitted, and we're currently kind of finalizing 20 that we're also going to translate into Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee languages, but kind of two that I think really speak to some of these stories that they have not seen. The first one there is about Treaty 20, which was the foundational treaty for the Peterborough area, and it talks about this partnership that occurred at the foot of the rapids, or Nagojoanon is what it's called today, as well as the Lake of the Mountain, which is a sacred site for the Kanien'kehá:ka or Haudenosaunee people just outside of the Bay of Quinte. And again, retelling new stories that were unfortunately never told within this plaque system that is currently going on as we speak. So that is an exciting project that I think has a lot of hope and is really driven by young voices that want to tell different stories about the past. And as I said, this aligns very well with Ontario Heritage Trust. They've been doing similar work. Right now, they've been going through all of their plaques and basically updating them in many ways. One of the best ones, I think, is at Shinwalk Hall Residential School, where they updated the plaque and actually made sure that Anishinaabe language was included and told the full story of what happened actually at that residential school, and talked about some of the deaths that occurred and really horrific abuses that happened at the hands of the church and government as well. So big steps are happening, I think, across many different commemoration industries, and it is nice to see this happening across Ontario. And as I kind of come to the end of my talk this evening, there is more opportunity. I think we have an expert on the Irish history and Canadian relations, David Wilson, speaking after, so I maybe won't go too much into this. Maybe he'll talk about it a little bit, but Peterborough was founded over 200 years ago this year as a result of Peter Robinson's kind of 9 ships that came from Ireland and started to settle what is now Peterborough. And I think there's lots of discussion to actually include Indigenous voices as well in these commemoration events to make sure it tells the full story of also the impact of this commemoration. And if we look around the world, there's lots of hopeful commemoration between the Irish people and Indigenous people. I think I can't get into too much of this, I would say. I'm kind of running out of time. But I encourage you to check out some of these monuments that tell different Indigenous stories with European nations that I think are very hopeful as well, such as the Kindred Spirits Monument, as well as this new one in the Choctaw Nation, which talk about the long legacy of helping each other as a result of the Irish famine. Indigenous nations actually donated thousands of dollars worth of their own money to help support the Irish people when they're going through the famine caused by British colonialization. And recent research has shown actually at the U of T that Indigenous nations here in Ontario also did the same thing, which is really cool. Some of our ancestors from Alderville actually signed this document giving money over to the Irish people, which I think is really hopeful as well, showing that I think there's other forms of commemoration. I wish this story is talked about more, and commemoration efforts focus on these stories between different nations rather than some of the other discussions that I think always go down the same route. So I'd like to kind of end it on those more hopeful note tonight. If you're encouraged to kind of read more about some of the work, we recently published this article with some colleagues that have been working on the story with the narwhal, and I encourage you to check it out. It kind of tells this in much more depth, and you can read some sources as well. But Shi Miigwech for this opportunity. I'll pass it over to the next speaker, Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Jackson. So I'm going to pass this on now to David to continue this discussion.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. And like everyone else, I'd like to thank you, Paul, and indeed Lynn, for organizing this event and bringing together people with such diverse viewpoints. And also, Jackson, thanks for playing William Prince, who's one of my favorite singers, and for highlighting the Indigenous contributions to Irish famine relief. My friend and colleague Mark McGowan has worked extensively on that, as you probably know. A little known story that's becoming much better known now. But what I'm going to do this evening is talk about how the Dictionary of Canadian Biography fits or does not fit in to the discussions that we're having. And let me begin with a story. In 2012, Historica Canada decided to design a special education portal to commemorate Queen Elizabeth's Diamond Jubilee, and they sent it to the Department of Heritage for feedback. The department sent it up to Stephen Harper's Prime Minister's office and got the word back: remove all images of Liberal politicians. Gone was the famous photograph of Pierre Trudeau and the Queen signing the Charter of Rights in 1982. In its place was an anodyne picture of the Queen shaking hands with members of the crowd. And indeed, if you look at its portal now, you will see lots of images of the Queen and nary a Liberal to be found. Now fast forward to 2017 and the centenary of the Halifax explosion, in which 2,000 people died and 9,000 were injured when a ship carrying munitions to France during the First World War collided with another ship in the harbour. Historica Canada decided to design a special education portal to commemorate the event. The portal went to the Department of Heritage for feedback. The department sent it up to Justin Trudeau's Prime Minister's office and got the word back: remove the reference to war from the title page. To be fair, it was okay to use it in the text, which was just as well, since explaining the explosion without mentioning the war would have been rather challenging. The point, I think, is clear, and it is one that everyone in this panel shares. Commemoration is inherently political. It inevitably boils down to simplicity, one-sidedness, and partisan history. It is essentially reductionist, it is potentially polarizing, and it reveals much more about the present than the past. Now, of course, the writing of history itself cannot be divorced from present preoccupations, from present perspectives. In the words of Gwynalf Williams, history, properly done, is above all an inquiry. And the kind of questions you put to the past depend on who you are, what you are, and when you are. Historical analysis involves a quest for the truth, even while recognizing that ultimate truth and ultimate objectivity are unattainable. As the Italian historian Carlo Ginzburg remarked, once you take truth out of the equation, the entire enterprise collapses. In my view, the key task of historians is to understand the past, to make it intelligible, while being aware of the dangers of applied history. That is, the application of history in pursuit of a particular cause, whether it's social justice, national pride, revolutionary ideology, or conservative reaction. Whether it's from Stephen Harper's Prime Minister's office or Justin Trudeau's Prime Minister's office. Fortunately, the Dictionary of Canadian Biography has not been subjected to the kind of pressures from above that other government-funded institutions have sometimes experienced, and we would resist them if we were. We have our problems, to be sure. Many of our biographies were written during the 1960s and 1970s. They inevitably reflect the historiography and assumptions of that time. Many of them need to be rewritten, even though we don't have adequate resources for the task. And this is particularly true of the biographies of 17th and 18th century Indigenous peoples. But we do what we can. Recent editorial changes have enabled us to do much more in the areas of Indigenous and Black history. We've hosted conference sessions on new biographies of Indigenous peoples. We have 70 new biographies of Indigenous peoples in the work and Métis in the works. And we've had a conference or conference sessions on Black Canadian history. We published 13 biographies over the last year on enslaved Blacks in the Maritimes and Upper Canada. And more recently, one of our editors has spent the best part of 2 months on a biography of Xinghua Kones, which will be well worth waiting for. We're committed to comprehending, not celebrating, commemorating, or denigrating the past. But we have responded to contemporary controversies over commemoration by adding new material to our existing biographies. I can certainly go into this in more detail later, but given the time constraints for now, our original biography of John A. Macdonald was very good as far as it went, but had hardly anything on his Indigenous policies and nothing at all on his attitudes towards Chinese immigration. So we commissioned 2 experts in their respective fields, Jim Miller and Pat Roy, to address those issues. Miller was highly critical of Macdonald's record, establishing hunger as a weapon to force First Nations in the Canadian West onto reserves, establishing residential schools that he described as, quote, largely engines of oppression, unquote, for children, presiding over the pass system and the permit system that kept them under tight control, outlawing the potlatch, and attacking the communal land system that First Nations favored. But Miller also rejected the charge of genocide, arguing that Macdonald's residential school policy, quote, heinous and frequently destructive, unquote, as it was, had not been developed, quoting again from the United Nations, with intent to destroy a definable group, and noting that Macdonald attempted to enfranchise Indigenous men without loss of status. Pat Roy was equally critical of Macdonald's Chinese policies, while noting that they reflected wider European views that the Chinese were an inferior race. The overall result is a biography that recognizes both the constructive and destructive consequences of his policies and suggests that there is no necessary contradiction between the two. Like the country he helped to found, runs the concluding sentence of the revised biography, he was large and contained multitudes. We also invited Bob Gidney, Egerton Ryerson's biographer, to address the controversy around the renaming of Ryerson University. Suffice it to say that his interpretation of Ryerson is significantly different from that of the task force that recommended the renaming, although he shares the view that Egerton Ryerson was, quote, essentially assimilationist. While the task force argued that Ryerson's report on industrial schools paved the way for the residential school policies of or at least the legacy paved the way for the residential school policies of the 1880s, Gidney argues that there's no evidence to support that view and much to contradict it. Similarly, actually, he disagrees, we can get into this later, he disagrees with the previously expressed view that Ryerson supported racially segregated racially segregated schools. Ryerson, Gidney argues, wanted voluntary attendance in schools that were run by and for Indigenous peoples, and wanted Indigenous students to become independent and self-sufficient and take over the running of the schools. The Federal Indian Residential Schools Act of the 1880s had the opposite intentions. They were controlled by non-Indigenous individuals for coercive entry into settler society under the auspices of people such as Clifford Sifton, who believed that Indigenous peoples were irredeemably inferior. Now, not everyone will agree, and not everyone should agree, but no texts are definitive, and all are open to debate, as we shall no doubt soon see. Thank you very much.
My apologies. Thanks so much, David. So I will now turn this over to Sean, last but not least.
Okay, well, thanks for bringing us together in conversation this evening about the role of memory, history, and commemoration. And thanks to everyone for taking time tonight to connect. I do really appreciate being in dialogue about this, especially today after we debrief from last night's election and think about the path forward in this country and perhaps the role that history plays. And given that I'm speaking last, I wasn't sure what would be left on the board after these smart speakers presented. So I decided to go in slightly a different direction rather than continue to talk about Macdonald and Dundas and Ryerson. I thought I would do something a bit different and more contemporary, but that I still think picks up on some of what's been said and might plant some seeds for further discussion tonight. So what I'm going to do is reflect on the contradictions of Canadian sovereignty in this moment, as I see it, past and present, as a scholar of Indigenous settler relations and someone who teaches courses in Canadian history and Indigenous studies. In particular, I teach a course called Inventing Canada, which looks at the role of commemoration in the ongoing process of inventing and reinventing the country, and actually uses Cecilia's book, Commemorating Canada, as the course text, which I think provokes a lot of deep reflection about the past, but also about the role of history in continually shaping what the country is becoming. What lessons we remember, what lessons we forget, and why, and what all of this says about Canada. And I think that recent events have sparked yet another moment of inventing and reinventing that requires careful consideration of many things, from history, yes, to things like sovereignty. In fact, I think debating Macdonald and Ryerson, those debates have been mostly settled. I think there are some people that are still angry about losing them, but I think we're moving on actually to different kinds of conversations about history. And I think the understanding of Canadian sovereignty and the ways in which the past can inform our understanding about what we do in this moment can be really informative. So that's what I'd like to shift our conversation to. So let me be clear from the start, elbows up, absolutely and unequivocally. Donald Trump's unhinged and aggressive far-right threats at expansionism in Canada and elsewhere, which he's repeated again this week, must be rebuffed and repudiated. Even in Poilievre's concession speech last night, he acknowledged that as much. In such times, I think we would do well to remember that we make our own history, but not in conditions of our own choosing. But that doesn't mean that we don't have important choices to make. In thinking about how we choose to respond, and this is going to be important in the coming days, months, and years, and by we, I mean non-Indigenous Canadians specifically, I'm going to root my reflections actually around the new I Am Canadian video that's getting a lot of buzz after it went viral on social media. So for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, the I Am Canadian beer commercial from Molson from 25 years ago, right, where this guy named Joe explains what makes him proud to be Canadian, has been remade in our moment as a defense of Canada in response to Trump's threat of annexing Canada as the 51st state. And I just want to show this very quickly. It's only a couple of minutes, and then I'll use that to ground my thoughts. And share sound. Oh, yeah, I've got this going. Wave at me emphatically if I don't got this, have the sound on. So let's take a look.
Hey, I know it's in our nature to cut a guy some slack, give him the benefit of the doubt, like maybe he was confused or just joking or just maybe really needed a double-double. But this isn't that guy. These aren't those people, and those are not the Rockies. They make a lot of mistakes. They mistake our modesty for meekness, our kindness for consent, our nation for another star on their flag, and our love of a hot, cheesy poutine with their love of a hot, cheesy Putin. They think they can bully us, threaten us, and push us around, but they do not know us. That artificially drawn line they keep talking about, not artificial, and it's not on a map. It's right here. This is the land that Terry ran, the land that Gord sang about. This is the birthplace of peanut butter and ketchup chips and yoga pants. It is the land of universal health care and the the bench clearing brawl of innovation and optimism and getting her done. This is the land of the peacekeeper and the Shawinigan handshake. Are we perfect? No, but we are not the 51st anything. We are the first to unite in a crisis, the first to build bridges, not walls, and the first to stand on guard for thee. My name is Jeff, and we are Canadian.
Okay. Let me go to the part that I want to pick up on here. So in this remake, Joe talks a lot about loving peanut butter, peacekeepers, and poutine, not Putin, in a funny defense of Canada in Trumpian times. There's a lot going on in this video. We could spend a whole hour deconstructing it, but I don't have that much time. I want to pause on this particular point. So interestingly, the remake of this I Am Canadian spot quickly glosses over Canada's own history of aggressive colonialism, the kind of antagonism the video challenges, and I think we should talk about it. So toward the end of the video, as the rant picks up in intensity, it briefly pauses its chest-pumping nationalistic rhetoric to ask, perhaps as a nod to reconciliation, which wasn't in the earlier version 25 years ago, are we perfect? No. Well, this image, the iconic image of the 1990 Oka crisis, or more correctly, the Mohawk resistance, is shown in the background. And this inclusion is important, but misleading. So let me explain, connecting the lessons of the past and present with a vision for a more honorable future, thinking about the ways that commemoration can help us do that. So the 78-day siege of the Mohawk communities of Kanesatake and Kahnawake by Quebec police and then the Canadian Army in 1990 was a state crackdown on Mohawk land defenders trying to prevent the expansion of a golf course over their active cemetery, sacred pine forest, and unceded territory. But what people don't realize is that this conflict was about more than a golf course and a dramatic confrontation. It was at root about 300 years of land theft by church and state. It was about British and then Canadian officials repeatedly stealing land and disavowing Mohawk sovereignty, despite taking the Mohawk word Kanata, or village, for the country's name, using the maple leaf from the maple tree, a Mohawk symbol of leadership, as its national symbol, to say nothing about borrowing Mohawk forms of government or relying on Mohawk military allies in the War of 1812, and then pivoting to more aggressive styles of dispossession afterwards. You think invoking fentanyl is a flimsy way to justify colonial aggression. Try digging into claims of terra nullius or colonial benevolence to steal Mohawk land on an ongoing basis. Still to this day, this conflict didn't actually solve that issue. So the I Am Canadian videos pointing to this conflict as an imperfection, which is an understatement, serves to occlude Canada's permanent history as a colonial aggressor in Mi'kmaq or Kanesatake territory here in Manitoba or in Wet'suwet'en on the West Coast. And here's the hopeful part. We can choose a different path. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was released 10 years ago today, since we're talking about commemoration, helps us see the opportunity in this. So volume 6, here I can stop sharing my screen so you can see me rather than this. Stop sharing. Oh, I think I've stopped sharing. So anyway, there it is. So they say in volume 6 of the TRC's report, this is on page 161, 162, they say, we believe that true reconciliation can take place only through a reshaping of a shared national collective memory of who we are and what has come before. This is their section on public memory. Reshaping national history is a public process, one that happens through discussion, sharing, and commemoration. As Canadians gather in public spaces to share their memories, beliefs, and ideas about the past with others, our collective understanding of the present and future is formed. They say public memory is dynamic. It changes over time as new understandings, dialogues, artistic expressions, and commemorations emerge. Public memory, much like national history, is also often contentious. And this is the important part. And then I'll conclude. Although public memory can simply reinforce the colonial story of how Canada began with European settlement and became a nation, the process of remembering the past together also invites people to question this limited version of history. So whether we're talking about Ryerson or Macdonald or something more recent like the Oka crisis, learning from the past rather than uncritically celebrating or unapologetically defending it to protect a narrow nationalism will, I think, actually give us a better shot at building a better Canada. In short, Trump's threat to Canada and the ways that we choose to defend ourselves in this moment and articulate notions of Canadian sovereignty and deploy understandings of history to do so should not distract us from the hard work of putting truth before reconciliation, of building stronger nation-to-nation relations with Indigenous people, and creating a more honorable future for all, rather than continually be tethered to toxic nostalgia of the past. So we can learn from the past, acknowledge it, and commit to doing better, all with the eye of keeping our elbows up. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. I'd like to thank all the panelists for such rich and engaging presentations. And so what we're going to do now for the next 10 minutes or so is I'm going to invite the panelists to speak to each other about each other's presentations with comments, questions, insights, and so on. So I'll just turn it over to whoever wants to go first, I think, and we'll see where that takes us. I guess one of the things that struck me, and I had not seen that video before, Sean, but one of the things that struck me was the use of Land of Hope and Glory as the soundtrack to it. I think there's something very interesting about using that particular piece of music to it. But anyway, that's just my observation. David, I see you.
Let me come in here, please. Thank you, Sean, for that presentation and the reference to the Oka crisis in the My Name is Canadian upgrade of a 25-year-old commercial. I don't think these debates are settled. And I refer here to something Catherine said earlier about commemoration, which is that commemoration is constantly changing. And as present perspectives change, our views of the past also change. And I suspect that with the threat that Canada is facing from Donald Trump and the nationalism in Canada, the extraordinary degree of nationalism that's been triggered, I would not be at all surprised if John A. Macdonald became rehabilitated as a national figure who helped to protect and preserve Canada from American encroachment. Do you think that's a possibility?
Well, I mean, I think the honest truth, and I'll just talk about you know, there was so much in Patrice's dog's breakfast comments there that I don't really know where to start. But let's start with the schools, right? I think what's going on is that a lot of people did not understand, to your point, David, that John A. Macdonald, despite many of the nation building activities that he did, he also was facilitating a number of Indian policies that were genocidal. Whether Jim Miller agrees with that or not is a separate issue. And one of them is schooling. So here's the hard part. I think a lot of people who didn't know about John A. Macdonald's deep involvement with bringing the different forces together that wanted to establish a national system of schooling, particularly boarding schooling or industrial schooling. I don't think a lot of people understood the high level of involvement that he played. And as a result, they're reconsidering why it would be appropriate to have an architect of a genocidal school system be uncritically commemorated in the name of a school. whether, to Patrice's point, whether parents, school board folks, trustees get all the details right, I think on that core issue, people understand, right, that maybe there needs to be a different decision there. We can have a debate historically, but in terms of uncritically commemorating someone like Macdonald for in a school name, I think people will, might be frustrated by that. But I think we have seen that Canadians do actually care about truth and reconciliation. We might disagree on what that looks like, but we understand those core components. And I mean, how did this all happen? Why did John A. Macdonald get put into the spotlight, right? That was because the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in its early pages, right, explained Macdonald's involvement in that system. And so our ideas about that system have changed historically over time, where many people thought it was benevolent, that it was of the times, that it was beneficial for Indigenous students, because that's what church and state officials were promoting. But we know that, of course, is a perspective. And the consequences of that genocidal system have been borne disproportionately by Indigenous people. And they don't think that we should be celebrating people who were involved in that system uncritically in the form of school names, public statues, although each community gets to make its own decision about that. That has changed. And the idea of rehabilitating John A. Macdonald as a hero who, rebuffed American advances, perhaps, but we've changed. Canada has changed. The people are more aware of these issues. And, we can have Patrice, write in pseudo history journals like the Dorchester Review that no graves have been found, et cetera, right? Pushing residential school denialism continually, right? But people have learned in this moment and can see through some of these things, right? That we know that more than 4,000 children died in those schools. And that, Patrice started off by saying, I remember. Patrice, you selectively remember. That's the issue. And in this moment, we are learning more about history and commemoration. And we are changing the way that we understand our engagement with these issues. And that's a good thing, actually, I think. That is an opportunity to grow, to change who we are, to participate in that process of reconstituting what our public memory is going to look like and how it can be useful in our present to create a better future, rather than narrowly defending the past. We might disagree, but that's where I've landed on these issues. And I think we have seen the Conservative Party of Canada run out Scheer, O'Toole, and Poilievre, all defending John A. Macdonald. All three have failed in the last 10 years to make that an issue that broad-based Canadians want to see. That might change, as you point out, David, right? It's settled now, but it might not be settled in the future. There may be other things that change. People get involved in that conversation. But I think right now it would be very difficult to trot out John A. Macdonald again as a hero, now that we understand that Macdonald is a complicated figure and that Canadians understand that.
Thanks, Sean. Any responses, or are there other questions that the panelists have raised that other panelists would like to address?
Could we, just to throw out a question, we talked about changes to names, erasing people from history. And I hear that a lot when I teach my students, this idea that changes to commemoration erases history. My contention is that of course, is not how history works. We're simply making different decisions. In fact, I teach a lot more about Macdonald these days than I did a decade ago. But I wondered if fellow panelists had an idea about how we have conversations with the public about the contentious nature of commemoration, and whether we can find agreement that changes to commemoration doesn't erase history. It simply makes different we make different kinds of decisions, and those can be debated and scrutinized. But I wondered if we could have that conversation, because I do see the public debating and discussing this often when issues of commemoration come up.
Well, I think debate and discussion are very important, which is why I raised an eyebrow when you said these debates are settled. I don't think they are, but we shall see. But debate and discussion are very important, and respect is very important as well. Respecting other people's viewpoints, not assuming bad faith. In fact, one of the things that struck me from the opening comments is that everybody here, in their different ways, is committed to a better Canada. Everyone is committed to truth, but there are significant differences over what truth actually means. So I would like to take up another of Patrice's points, which was, in a sense, I think, Jackson, elaborated a little by you, and that is expanding commemoration, that it's not a zero-sum game, that we can retain the names of Dundas and Ryerson and Macdonald in these schools, but we can also include the names of many others. And I suppose much of this boils down to how people weigh up the contributions that people have made in the past against the flaws that they have. And I think for many people in Canada who are aware of the flaws, the flaws outweigh the contributions. But for many others, contributions outweigh the flaws. And I don't think, Sean, that it's the defeat of the Conservatives had anything to do with their attitudes on John A. Macdonald. I think much bigger issues were involved there. So I would question that. But I think it's very difficult to find common ground when you either have a statue or you don't. You either have a university named Ryerson or you don't. You either have a school named Dundas or you don't. And in our current climate, I think issues of commemoration have become inherently polarizing, and I struggle to see where common ground might be found, and I welcome other people's views on this.
Could I ask? I was going to say, Patrice, would you like to respond to?
It's one of the point I was trying to make precisely is that commemoration is not a zero-sum game. There is plenty of room to commemorate Sir John A. Macdonald and Egerton Ryerson, or Dundas, and Indigenous contributions. There's tons of opportunities to do it, and people are open to it. If there's something significantly different of Canada in 2025 as compared to Canada in 1975 or Canada in 1940, is this openness to appreciating the richness of our past. Why not capitalize on that? Why not take advantage of it? Why does it mean that Ryerson? My good friend Catherine. I'm gonna dispose of that quickly. The issue is not that Ryerson was renamed. I don't care. I really don't care. The problem with the way Ryerson was disposed of is the problem. It was a denigration of his contribution. He accomplished many great things. That Ryerson in 2025 is not a name that will attract students from Calcutta or Shanghai really is the issue. It's not the issue of Ryerson's involvement with Indigenous people, which, by the way, were quite positive, certainly not worthy of condemnation. Ryerson accomplished a great deal, and he deserves to be remembered for what he accomplished. Again, in an environment where, while we are open to new commemoration, our society is vastly ignorant of our history. And that, in a context of an aggressive American entity, is going to be our only defense. That's the first time I see that silly commercial. And you really shouldn't put that much stock in something so poorly produced. Yeah, there should have been a great deal more Indigenous presence in that video. I agree with you completely. It's wrong. It should have been done. And we know better than that. But my point is, it's, again, I come back to that. It's not a zero-sum game, and our politicians are driving a zero-sum game. The people in the Toronto District School Board invented history, invented it in order to justify. And again, I point out, and they played the race card on top of that to bring even more venom into the discussion. Thankfully, 7 of the racialized members of that school board did not vote, voted against the proposal. And that, I think, tells you volumes about where the promise of this country really is. The politicians, as I said, I blame the politicians. I don't blame the Sean Carletons or the Jackson Pins or the Catherine. You do your job. You do what you want. You say what you want. It's when the politicians start meddling around, and instead of aspiring to something better, as they do in Europe, where you can have, a statue to Danton, against a statue of Robespierre. Why can't you have that? Why can we not have that? Now, some people are opposed to statues, and I appreciate that. But, Jackson demonstrated beautiful pictures of wonderful Indigenous monuments, places of peace. I applaud that. I hope to visit it. I still miss John A. Macdonald's noble statue on the common grounds on the Central Park of Kingston. It's not my favorite statue, I have to say. I like him better in his business attire in Toronto and in Hamilton, but there it is. I really miss, and I've written about it in a pseudo-historical journal. Sorry, thanks for that, Sean. The Macdonald Monument being abolished, removed violently by 20-odd people in Montreal. That monument, by the way, was paid for by people, not by the state. And when it was inaugurated, the audience, the attendance, was anywhere between 10 and 20,000 people. That was a democratic gesture. A democratic gesture honoring a prime minister who'd been elected democratically 6 times to a majority. I know this offends people to be reminded of it, but he was Democrat. He wasn't Ceausescu. And anywhere between 10 and 20,000 people. My grandparents, my great-great-grandparents might have been there on their way to the United States because they couldn't find jobs. They came back. But that matters. And the memory of those people who remembered is important. We have a long way to go, but why do our politicians have to be so antagonistic? Why do the cretins of the Toronto District School Board adopt such a position? There are lots of schools in the Toronto District School Board that need to be renamed. Truly grotesquely named schools, meaningless names. Our city, our villages, our towns should be an open book to our history. Again, I'm going to talk about European countries. Okay, I'm going to shut me up. Okay,
yeah.
that's fine.
No, just because of the time constraints, and I think we've got a number of audience questions.
Sorry.
So I'd like to ask Catherine and Jackson if they would like to respond to our discussion and then move on to the audience questions.
Sure, I'll just want to add in briefly with this, circling back to, I think, something that David said about or sort of echoed what I said earlier about the continuous practice and reflection that goes into questions of commemoration. And I think that's really critical. A lot of what people think about when they think about commemoration, I think, and in debates about who gets commemorated or how they get commemorated, we think about the past. I think David's point about it being very much reflective of what's going on now is critical. Add to that with specific reference to the task force, the Standing Strong task force, as I tried to emphasize earlier, we were very much future oriented. So there was certainly a historical research component to our mandate, which we executed. And I think we gave quite a comprehensive, if fairly brief, account of the research into Ryerson and his impact and his work and his legacies. But really, ultimately, our recommendations were very future-oriented. We were thinking about where the university was in 2020, 2021, and more importantly, where we wanted to be in the future, and what we were hearing from our community about their aspirations, their values, and thinking about the university of the 21st century, not commemoration in a kind of past way. The renaming ceased to commemorate Ryerson, but it certainly didn't remove Ryerson. And I think I'll also come back to what Sean was saying about Macdonald. I've talked a whole lot more about Egerton Ryerson, and a whole lot more people know about Egerton Ryerson and the work that he did in all facets of that work, post task force around Toronto, certainly, than they did know before that, where many people actually didn't know that the university was even named after a person at all. So there are multiple consequences, but fundamentally our work was future oriented.
Thank you. Jackson, any thoughts?
Yeah, very good. That was an interesting conversation so far. I've been kind of jotting down some few notes I feel like I can respond to. I think the first one is just the role of politicians. I think they always kind of jump on topics that are what they believe to be important and try to sway some people's opinions. I think we overvalue, I think, politicians' opinions on history. And from my experience just working with the trust, they have largely no say of what goes on the discussions of commemoration, especially over plaques. There's over 1,000 plaques right now in the Ontario Heritage Trust collections. And the Doug Ford government has not done anything really to change any one of those plaques. And that's been a largely independent process. And they consult with historians as they go through that process. And there are many plaques, I think, right now there's opportunities to change and expand more of the narrative to have Indigenous perspectives. If you look at Peterborough, for instance, there's 0 plaques that talk about Treaty 20, for instance, or any Indigenous presence. It's all about Catherine Partrail, Peter Robinson, the very first doctor who they say was non-Indigenous or non-Indigenous person, when there's lots of Indigenous medical practitioners in that area. And I think there is lots of opportunities to make sure more of these stories are being told. And I think if we look at I think more of Indigenous stories, we can also see this resistance to American imperialism in many ways as well. If we think about the War of 1812, there's many Anishinaabe leaders that sided with the British that actually allowed British to be successful in those fights with the Americans. And I think commemorating those folks rather than Macdonald, who came way after that period, as important to actually the foundation of this country as well. I think going back to the 1764 Treaty of Niagara, which I think is so important to the foundation of this country. It preceded what America would become. Actually, America got very upset with some of the agreements that happened and led to some of the War of Independence that would later happen about, I guess, 10 years later. And I think going back to those stories and showing us how this has been inherently a part of our story here, and the lands north of that border, I think, are important moving forward. So those are just some thoughts I can respond to, and happy to answer some questions in the comments as well. I think we have a few folks pretty upset as well, which is always great to have some of the conversation.
Great. Thank you, Jackson. So now I'm going to ask Mariah to read out the questions. Well, I mean, I think I'd like to really focus on questions rather than only comments. But Mariah, I will turn this over to you right now.
Thank you, Cecilia. One question we have in the chat: as historians, what duty do we have to individual people in the past? What is it? And what sort of duty is it? Professional, disciplinary, ethical?
Really interesting question.
May I?
Whoever would like to pick that one up.
Yeah, I mean, this is what we deal with all the time in the Dictionary of Canadian Biography. What duty do we owe to individual people in the past? Above all, honesty and understanding them in their own terms. What we must never do when we are dealing with people in the past is present caricatures, people who are sort of treated in a hagiographical way, treated like saints, or people who are seen as sort of cardboard cutout villains. Complexity, nuance, subtlety, respect, understanding, and as I say, honesty. Of course, one major difference facing historians from other people making such comments is that the dead can never answer us back. Their subsequent relatives can certainly answer us back, and that's happened. But we mustn't. I don't think it's our role as historians to be doling out praise or blame. I mean, as historians, once we've tried to understand people and what they do and why they do it and what their impact was, we can certainly make moral judgments about that. Of course we can, and we should. And indeed, we will have moral judgments about them as we go. And I think we need to check those as much as possible, and try and be very much aware of the prejudices that we might be bringing in, the biases. We might even try and think about unconscious biases that we have. In fact, we should do that to make sure that we're as fair-minded as possible. So those are some of the things that I would say in answer to your very good question.
Yeah. Anyone else would like to respond to that question?
Simply to say that I think that the most important thing historians can do is situate people in their context. That is what makes historians different from other people who do not have a training in history. Understanding context is everything. If you don't understand context, you don't understand the person. And so you're judging that person by the standards of today or by the standards of other times. And that's what the DCB does to an excellent degree.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Yeah, just quickly, I think I actually agree, David. I think one of the issues is that history and commemoration are quite different at times. Much easier to explain nuance and complexity, situating figures in their own period, understanding things is very different than an uncritical statue, for example, or an honorific naming of something. And that becomes the issue, right? Is that a John A. Macdonald school name is not actually conveying any of the complexity or of the critique, for example, that was evident of him in his own time. It's an honorific. It's a celebratory form, and I think maybe that's some common ground that we can find, is that if we are interested, and I hope we are, in helping people understand the complex lessons of the past, that commemoration debates actually aren't the best way to do that. And it is very easy to become entrenched in sort of polarized ways. So we need to find other forms of, as the TRC was saying, having that discussion about public memory and teaching people about the past, the full complexity of the past, rather than the sort of narrow curated versions that people often use for political gain, for political reasons. And so I think that as historians, not just in the academy, but historians broadly, and I know there are a number of public historians involved in a variety of organizations doing this hard work too, and perhaps we can be quiet and get to some more discussion on that. I think that that's an important component of this discussion of how do we do that? How do we teach the complex, a complex understanding of the past rather than a celebratory, curated version through commemoration?
Yes, but let's not confuse the issues here. The debate tonight is about commemoration. It's not about writing history. And so, the subject of our discussion should be, how do we commemorate? And who's in charge of commemoration? And what rules should they follow? My point simply is that there are no rules. People are inventing it as they go along, making mistakes clumsily, as I demonstrated when I quoted that associate director of education at Toronto District School Board. It's an embarrassment. It's an embarrassment. If the Toronto District School Board is serious, then they should have serious historians talking about what is at stake here, instead of mindlessly making decisions without the facts, and more importantly, without a vision of what commemoration should be, which should be a uniting activity, not a divisive one. And I said, there's going to be a backlash. There's going to be a backlash, and it's unfortunate because it'll stifle discussion. This is easy to have, a discussion among PhDs, great. But when you're talking to people who don't know the country, who've arrived here, who don't understand it, who really want to understand it, you got to start with a discussion. So we're on the same wavelength here. My issue is a public policy issue. where do you install that discussion? How do you engage it? And where does it lead? And at what point, perhaps, where do you involve people like us who are experts in the matter? That's all I'm saying. There has to be a rule book, and we're nowhere near that.
Thanks, Patrice. Mariah, any other questions that we should be considering? I'm just keeping an eye on the time here.
There is a question in the chat for Jackson. This person would love to hear more about your fabulous student assignment.
Yeah, Miigwech for that question. That assignment's actually been kind of redone a few times. Actually, it started in the 1990s by David Newhouse, who is kind of a legendary Indigenous instructor here at Trent. And he designed this project to explore people's homelands of where they come from before they get to Trent. And many people have not, as kind of Patrice has been saying, know their history and really know the Indigenous history of the lands that they're on. So that was kind of the first version. Then when we got to Trent, we kind of added some more different perspectives onto that to ask them to expand that as well, to look at historical plaques in their community, because we find historical plaques usually tell a single story of what's been happening in their communities. And all the students start recognizing that story that's being told and really try to critique those plaques and offer new examples of stories that they could include. So that's how we've kind of enlisted it now in the first year course, and it seems to be really well received, I think, in many ways, because it asks students to actually play an active role in their own understandings of the past and not just passively receive it. And I think it's important to remember that the plaques and these statues are the first time a lot of people are learning about this history. And I think when they only tell one side of the story, or a very simple story in many ways, it can make their understandings of the past not correct, or I wouldn't say correct, but not fulsome in many ways of how Indigenous people also experience that past right alongside, usually in the background of a lot of those stories. And I think this assignment has done a great job of trying to expand those stories and make sure different stories are told. And a lot of times as the professors of the course, we learned more about these local areas, little towns, little stories that come out. And I think those are really enriching for us as well. But Miigwech for that question.
Thanks, Jackson. Mariah, any other questions?
Yes, it is my understanding that the Indian chiefs of the day wanted the residential schools because they did not want their children left behind. Are there comments from the panelists on this?
Oh. Throw that out to whoever would like to respond.
I'm happy to speak to that a little bit in the context of Egerton Ryerson. I think we need to be very careful in separating, say, the 1840s context and Egerton Ryerson's plan of 1847 for Indigenous boarding schools that were voluntary, they were agriculture focused, and they were in specific communities where there had been discussion and there had been agreement and transfers of funds for formal schooling. We need to separate that from the Indian residential school system that grew up in the 1880s. I think that's critical. They are all part of the colonial educational ecosystem, which Sean and others have written about so effectively. But it's not the same. It's not the same thing that we're talking about here from, even late 18th century, early 19th century, mid 19th century into the Indian residential school system. That is not what Indigenous people or communities and leaders wanted for their children in any shape or form. So just draw that distinction, I hope, clearly.
Yeah, just another quick point. Often you will hear similar talking points. The Indigenous people ask for the system, so what's the big deal? Particularly here in the prairies, people will say, in the negotiation of the treaties, Indigenous people asked for residential schools, so they wanted this. Essentially, it's a form of denialism. It's a form of minimizing. The quick historical point is that many Indigenous parents saw and understood the complex matrix of what colonialism was doing in that time period and wanted education for their children. But they already had education. They wanted schooling. in particular to help them navigate the colonial society. But many of the numbered treaties, if you look at the educational provisions, often more about getting resources for education for Indigenous people to control themselves. They weren't asking for what becomes a compulsory system where children were removed from community. So just a quick point on how sometimes that idea that Indigenous people wanted this gets used as a way of minimizing the harm of the system overall.
Yeah, and I can just jump in quickly too. For Alderville First Nation, they had one of the first residential schools kind of following Ryerson's plan. And many chiefs wanted some form of schooling at that time. As Catherine says, a very different system at that point. The Methodists that were somewhat in charge at the early days actually used some Anishinaabe language in their prayer books, for instance, to try to convince them to actually go through with that religious understanding. And it's also important to remember that forced removal, that 10 years late before that, they'd been removed from their traditional ways of life into a different community. And they saw the changes that were happening, and as a result wanted schooling for their children as well to survive. So just a little bit more context from that especially time period.
Yeah. As a historian of Upper Canada, Jackson, I think that's really important. Really important. I think Mariah's got, we've got time for one more question. I think Mariah's got a question to throw out at us again.
So there are a few questions in the chat just asking the panelists' thoughts on the path forward for commemoration, if we do commemoration at all. For instance, what are your thoughts on swinging back the pendulum to naming schools SS Toronto, SS Ottawa, etc., and stop naming schools after people?
Okay. Okay. Catherine, I can see a hand up.
I'll throw one thing in there. So when we did a very large community engagement project, when the implementation of the renaming of the university got underway, and we had well over 30,000 people who responded in different forms to this question of so what should the new name be? Or more importantly, what kind of principles should the renaming committee keep in mind as they assessed and decided among the thousands of different options that were also submitted? And we heard overwhelmingly that people did not want the university to be named after a person. There were 3 possible categories of names, and the third by a long shot in terms of popularity was to be named after a person. So now that's only in the context of the university, obviously. I can't generalize from that, but people also included the reasons why they chose as they did, and other possible names that they wanted to submit. And there was a great deal of concern about what might be uncovered about anyone that the university would be named after a different person. Might there be, skeletons in the closet or further contentious aspects of it? Overwhelmingly, what people wanted, what came out of that community engagement was people wanted a place. They wanted the place, the location, the land on which the university stands to be represented in the name, not a person.
It's good marketing.
From our point, I guess what I would say is that, so much of these conversations have been polarized and used as a way of convincing people that changes to commemoration are a threat to them, to their understanding, to their particular understanding of the past. But what I think that misses is the opportunity that changes to commemoration can play in building community. And we might disagree on what that looks like, but I think, Patrice and I disagree on many things, but I think maybe that is something that is there, that commemoration is a process that can be contentious, but it can also bring people together to envision not how do we defend what Canada has been, but also in determining what Canada could be. And I think seeing commemoration as an opportunity is, perhaps one way of understanding the way forward and thinking about this rather as a battle, but trying to determine how do we create better present and future. That I think is something in the work of commemoration that is important. How we do that, I think, is undetermined. I think there does need to be discussions about how we do this. But I hope we all can agree that we want to create a better future, and that understanding our past in more fulsome ways rather than selective, kind of more whitewashed ways doesn't really help us. It actually creates problems that when people find out that Macdonald wasn't just this wonderful hero, that they have a problem. They are unprepared to deal with, for example, the moment of truth and reconciliation. So I think commemoration it should be seen as an opportunity to understand the past in ways that can help create a better future.
Commemoration is important. I think we can agree to that. I mean, we can rename our schools PS1, PS2, PS15, whatever. We can name our schools after their location. That's what we do. Toronto Metropolitan, University of Toronto, Scarborough College, whatever. But at some point, remembering is important. Remembering is what anchors us to our community. Remembering is a social activity. It should not be forgotten. The challenge is to bring as many of us together. I come back to my Toronto District School Board because it's important. It is a social institution. It's not just the people who are attending or working there. It's the people who live there. The whole school board should be an open book onto our history. It's, and maybe I'm being a male here, and that males tend to, maybe I'm wrong, but I think males like to have heroes. And I think that the naming of schools in favor of heroes, including, the school that honors Sean Carleton, remembers great people, right? It remembers General Carleton or Dorchester. It remembers Isaac Brock. It used to remember Ryerson. My point is that there is a purpose to remembering. There is a social purpose. We do not hear about our history. We are less and less, as a society, informed about our history. The history departments are depleted. That is a fact across the country. We are not studying history. The people who graduate in the arts are not studying history, let alone the engineers, the doctors, and everybody else who actually really matters in this discussion. But remembering matters. And so if we are not studying at university, if we are not living with our grandparents and hearing about the old ways, if we are not communicating in society, if we are not working together, we are all working apart. Society is atomizing us as individuals. We have nothing in common, except perhaps a noble exercise in commemoration. We all agree it has to be done properly. That's the point here, is that it's not being done properly. And my fear is that this is going to atomize us even further. And there has to be a way to convince our politicians to do it better. And politicians, I'm talking about, Toronto District School Board and everybody else. The current ways don't work. But I still think that there is a purpose to commemorating. There is a purpose to our preserving of old buildings. I've long worked in heritage buildings. The issue around heritage buildings, this matters. Some people will call it colonialism. It matters to me that we preserve a home from the 18th century, the 19th century. It matters to me. I think that this anchors us. Anyway, the point is, commemoration is a good thing. It just has to be done right.
Well, thanks, Patrice. I have to evoke chair's privilege here and thank everyone for such an engaging and lively discussion. And I would say, though, that actually it's not just heroes. Heroines also end up playing quite a role.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes.
Perceptions of the past.
There's a desperate shortage.
Well, that's a whole other discussion. But thank you so much to all of the panelists, to Paul and to Lynn and to Miria for organizing this, and to you in the audience for sending in your questions and thoughts and being here tonight. Thank you, and I think good night.